welcome to this panel discussion. It's really great actually seeing so many of you here, and especially having your cameras on. It's really nice. It's a treat. I usually don't get to see people, so I'm really glad to do that. Please use the chat to say hi. Let us know where you are joining us from. And also throughout the session, just use the chat, to share your thoughts, your reflections, and ask questions. I want it to be a safe space, so please be respectful, keep it respectful. And if you have any questions while we are having the discussion and you want to ask us a question, please write question in capital letters before your message, so that after, we have had our discussion and I'm opening the floor for questions, I'll go through the chat to find the question. So when you write question, I can find it easier. What else? Yes, after the discussion, I'm going to go through all the comments, read them, and we'll probably share some of them on Instagram Live, unless you don't want to have your comments shared. So please write that as well. But I want you to feel that, your voice is also being heard, because it is not just that like the four of us, we are experts on what veganism is and whether we need a new word. So it's it affects all of us. Now, hopefully it is a safe space, but if for some reason a troll has managed to get in and I noticed that, or if somebody alerts me, you are going to be removed. I'm not going to give any warning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with actually an amazing panel. For those of you who don't know me, and I think a lot of people don't know me, I'm Leila. I'm actually an Iranian. I grew up in Austria, but I'm living in the UK. I became vegan after getting involved in dog rescue work, in Romania especially. So animal rescue is really close to my heart. But my main job is I'm a decolonial nutritionist and educator. I'm also the founder of Plant-Based Health Justice. It is a non-profit that works at the intersection of planetary and human health and racial and animal justice. Our focus is actually on communities in the global south. I want actually to let my panelists introduce themselves. So I'm going to go alphabetically. I always try to be kind of fair. So Estefania, we are going to start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what made you feel that we need a new name for veganism?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Leila. Yes, I'm super excited to be part of this panel today. Many of you also don't know me. My name is Estefania. I am currently located in Anacostan and Piscataway territory, also known as Washington, D.C. I'm a proud Colombian immigrant, community organizer, and executive director for Vegemijas. For those that don't know about Vegemijas, we are a collective of global majority and gender expansive folks reclaiming ancestral foodways and working at the intersection of food and environmental justice. And I think that, back to the question, I believe that we need a decolonial term for veganism because I believe the word often erases the cultural and historical relationship that many BIPOC communities have and always have had with plant-based and sustainable living long before it became this Western elitist term that, we know today. I think it's a word that is really based on Eurocentric context and has been very disconnected from our ancestral practices and the indigenous practices of people across the world. And I think that, it has erased a lot of the collective, intergenerational, reciprocal ways of being in our cultures. And I think that, the colonization has really disconnected us from those practices, and it really accounts for that. So yeah, just very excited to be here today and continue the conversation.
Thank you. Waseem, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Waseem. I am located in Kujibuktuk, Halifax, also called Halifax in Turtle Island, Canada. And I am a food blogger, recipe creator, and content creator behind the blog Plant-Based Arab, which I founded about 5 years ago now. Changed names, but anyway, and I work specifically around veganizing and showcasing the naturally vegan plant-based Arab recipes, specifically to draw attention to those that are within my community, within my culture, to get a touch of what veganism is about from the food perspective. We all know that veganism is not just about food, but that's the area that I actually was introduced to. And of course, as I grew with that learning, I understood more and more about the injustice that we see in the animal kingdom. And that's where I focus mostly. And then I'm also part of the team for Vegans for Palestine, the collective. And that's where we educate and unite vegans for a free Palestine. We do a lot of education around decolonization, and then also how the vegan movement is highly used by the Israeli government specifically to deter everybody that's within the vegan movement from criticizing and also standing with Palestinians. So that's mostly the work that I'm involved in at this time. And for your question, why we need a new term for veganism. So in my opinion, I think we need to decolonize the term itself, whether or not to come up with a new term or not. But the idea comes from the whole, really, we're in a time where everything is trying to be decolonized with what we're seeing in the world, whether it's Palestine, Congo, or Sudan, and everywhere else, with the capitalist oligarchy in the US as well. So I think that the term itself has been used in a way that does not fully shape the movement and what the animal rights are all about. And we can talk more about that later. But obviously, with the silence from the major organizations, many of the major organizations towards the genocide, they're really giving a bad reputation, bad shape of what veganism is about. And we need to reshape that, whether it's redefining it, finding a new term that best suits the global South and the majority of the world, not just the Western world within that. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Yvette, before we come to you, I want to make sure that I'm recording because it doesn't show on my screen. Okay, Yvette, go on.
We are being recorded, just FYI, yes. Thank you, Leila, and it's an honor to be here. And I appreciate everyone with the willingness to hear what I have to say about anything. So I'm the Director of Activism and Community Impact at Apex Advocacy, which is a Black-led animal rights nonprofit with the mission to get more Black, Indigenous, and people of color involved in animal rights through a collective liberation lens. So I'm an activist and a writer, and I'm just trying to inspire the vegan movement as a movement for total liberation. That's me in a nutshell. As for your question, Leila, you already know, trying to ask me for 1 or 2 sentences about why we need a new term or a decolonial term is like asking me for a novel, but handing me like a sticky note to write it on. It's not going to happen. So the first thing is, I don't believe we should get too hung up on the semantics of whether the word vegan is colonial in origin. The very philosophy of veganism as a species-inclusive anti-oppression stance is inherently decolonial, I feel, even when the term was coined in 1944. I've said that before, but the reality right now is that vegan as an identity has a major PR problem. I think we all know it's evolved and become this thing shaped by values of individualism, capitalism, and whiteness and so forth, which are, wait for it, colonial values. So I think most of us are aware that research shows it's one of the most negatively viewed labels, second only to those addicted to drugs. And outside of our circles, it's mainly understood as an irritating diet or lifestyle trend and not a social justice movement. So that's one of the main reasons why I think we could use a term that not only resonates with decolonial frameworks, but also signals liberation and justice to people who might otherwise dismiss the concept entirely. And reframing language, including that of animal advocacy, is a necessary step towards aligning any movement with principles of decolonization, and also anti-oppression and collective liberation. And words and concepts really matter for those who are not clear on that. They shape ideologies, they shape practice, and the language we use can either expand or limit our ability to connect with others and be more effective. And right now, veganism is not giving what it's supposed to.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts. You know, you have already touched on so many interesting, aspects of this discussion. Personally, I feel that before we can even begin our discussion, we need to have a definition. What is decolonization? Especially because I think, since October 7th, I feel the global South, the people, from the global South, they have risen. People, have had enough of the ways the global North has demonized us, our ways of life, our traditions. And I have been seeing Instagram accounts talking about decolonizing health, decolonizing love, and so much more, Now, I want to make one thing clear. I don't believe that decolonizing is about going back to how our ancestors lived or just doing whatever the global South used to do pre-colonialism. I actually looked it up, and according to the Oxford Dictionary, decolonization is the process of a state withdrawing from a former colony and leaving it independent. Or, there's another one, the process of freeing an institution or sphere of activity from the cultural or social effects of colonization. So, for me, I see decolonization as undoing colonialism. And although colonialism was a political act, occupying land and exploiting and stealing resources, but in order to justify that, the colonizers had actually to believe in their own superiority. They had to believe that their religion, their food, their way of life was better. It was given to them by God. I know it sounds familiar, right? And to do that, they had actually to colonize our minds, the minds of indigenous people. So they had to make us, or the indigenous people, the people of the global south, feel inferior, less than. And I think that is why we still see BIPOC who support the dominant white narratives. I don't even need to mention, we know those BIPOCs who do the dirty work of the Western governments. And when it comes to vegan, spaces, we see BIPOC vegans who partner up with corporate vegan brands, and they promote capitalism. And Yvette has already touched on capitalism. So, decolonization is really about challenging the dominant discourse, the things we call normal and take for granted. When I posted about this panel, some of you may have seen that a BIPOC actually said, English is the global language, as if it is just a fact. English is the global language. There is no such thing as a neutral, objective fact. Not language, sexuality, food, politics, nothing is neutral. All of us, we have been shaped by colonial education systems, by media and social conditioning, all of that. And, these mainstream ideas have shaped us. And when I say us, that includes myself. So to be decolonizing our minds is really about unlearning and undoing all of that all the time. So it's a process. It's not going to end tonight, definitely not. And also, decolonization is not just about changing our mindsets. It has to be followed by action. We have actually to repair the damage that has been done. Or let's say the colonizers have to repair the damage that has been done. So it is about giving back land, for example. Or if somebody has power and resources, they have to distribute those resources. And we have to keep naming those ongoing realities of colonialism. We have vegan organizations that have a lot of resources, and they shape discourse by creating materials, even conducting research on veganism. They tell us, what we have to do. They tell us what activism look like. For example, they say, let's use dead bodies of animals as props during a march, or use graphic images to, wake people up. And then they change their minds and say, actually, no, let's ask for consent before showing them those graphic videos. And we take these practices for granted. But these practices are not neutral. They come from a specific worldview. And so it's time that we question those, practices, those ideas, and the way things are being done. So that is, I hope, that is what I believe this panel discussion is. And I could go on about all of these, the ideas and practices that we take for granted and just as facts. But I wanted to offer this just as an introduction. I wanted to invite you to keep an open mind. Because, whether you are here live or later, for those of you who are going to watch the recording, I'm sure we will discuss things today that might go against everything you have been taught. So your first reaction might be actually to reject it or to get defensive. So I really invite you to, sit with it and reflect on it. Now, my first question is actually for all of you on the panel, but also everybody who is attending this live webinar. I want you to write, your responses in the chat, and I will, as I said, go through all the comments in the chat, and I will share some of them later on social media. So my question is, what does the word veganism bring up for you? personally, politically, and culturally. I'm going to actually copy paste. I have it somewhere here. I'm going to write it in the chat. And Yvette, do you want to go first?
Do I? Do I ever? So what comes up for me is a very mixed bag of emotions and things. On the one hand, it's deeply tied to my beliefs, collective liberation, and in rejecting the exploitation and commodification of life itself. But on the other hand, it means being constantly misunderstood. I know that if we all walked outside right now, asked 100 strangers, what is veganism? The answers would be overwhelmingly about diet or lifestyle. Maybe one person, if we're lucky, would mention anti-speciesism or anything remotely systemic. And that misunderstanding is really frustrating because I don't think that my life should require a special label to express that I also value the lives of others. And the fact that I or anyone else has to adopt a term like vegan to underscore that animals belong in our politics, that we mean it when we say collective liberation, is quite frankly a little exhausting. And then there's how easily the term gets co-opted. It's marketed into oblivion as a consumer lifestyle, vegan products and experiences, and all while distancing us from the critical framing that animals are part of the exploited working class fighting for their own liberation. So I'll say that again. Animals are agents of their own liberation, which brings us to the savior complex. So culturally, as someone in the US, veganism has a lot of white saviorism in the mix, which is a whole other panel discussion if anyone's willing. But it results in a reality where we're supposed animal allies call animals voiceless, instead of pointing out how society actively silences them, or that animals resist in countless ways in escaping and refusing and yearning for freedom. But to then frame them voiceless also very obviously frames them as helpless or without agency, and only reinforces the systems that harm them and exploit them. So in its current form, veganism too often puts us, the allies, the good and the bad, at the center of the story, when the focus, I believe, should be on the victims and their resistance. And that's what I want to see shift very urgently.
Thank you. Waseem, do you want to go next?
I mean, how do I top off what Yvette just said? It was perfect. I think, so for me, as I have to admit, I did have a preconceived notion of what veganism went prior to actually understanding it. And that is because it was mainly shaped by diet. And how I came to actually understand it, I can't remember who or what the exact words were, but somebody once said that, like, at the core of it, it's like being anti-speciesism, in the sense that understanding that to an animal, their baby is worth to them just as much as our babies are worth to us. So understanding that, as Yvette kind of put, that they're, agents of their own liberation, is the same way. Just understanding that we do not, of course, we do not need to be consuming or harming or inflicting any type of harm onto the animals to live our life. We realize this, whether it's through the technology of alternatives and so on, but it's not about that. Like, how I see it right now is that recognizing that sentient beings also feel what we feel. It may not be explained or communicated in the same language as we do, but Yvette also touched on that, saying that they're not voiceless on their own. So, like, they do resist in their own way. They do have those eyes that tell us, like, don't do this. If you watch these documentaries, people going into factory farms and trying to rescue them, they talk a lot about the eyes and what they see from there. So there's a lot of connection to the animals that we need to sit with, aside from them being, also to your point before, like, as a subgroup or lesser than us, or that we have dominion over them, or that we're more supreme to them. That all actually unfolded with me over the last few years, in the sense that, people who know oppression also recognize and sit with this as soon as they actually are introduced to it. And you don't even have to read about it, watch documentaries. You just need to be having that conversation with people. If you talk to somebody who knows oppression and you explain to them this type of oppression about the animals, then it's automatic for them to see that connection. Unfortunately, the savior complex with that, as Yvette also said, that puts us in a place where like it's centering us, that, oh my God, I feel bad for living all this life consuming, you know, animal meat and so on, and harming them. That's not about you though. Like, you've done that in the past because of, again, maybe it's colonial thinking, maybe it's ways, culture, tradition, or whatever it may be. But just recognize that like what you are now, after being introduced to this point, you need to start shaping the way of life that you want to live by in order to actually not hurt others. And just to sum it up, you know, the word vegan for me is really just about that. It's about every sentient living being has their own worth that is not more or less than the other. And that's what I think veganism at least should be about.
Thank you. Estefania, do you want to go next?
Thank you. And yeah, thank you, Yvette and Waseem. Those were amazing answers. I think for me, yes, veganism also brings up a lot of mixed emotions. I have been on this, I started my plant-based living journey in 2013, and it really was more of a response to like the environmental destruction and animal suffering that I was witnessing and learning about in school, and also just as a way to reconnect to like the knowledge and the traditions that my ancestors already knew. I think for a while, it did take me a while to kind of start from like vegetarian and to like kind of moving up into like fully vegan. I think a big part of it definitely had to do with, you know, just how the term, and I believe like white veganism itself kind of ignores the complexity of people's connection to the land, to the animals, and to community in terms of cultural relationships and cultural food ways and cultural traditions. And as Yvette mentioned earlier too, I think it continues to reinforce this idea of like individualism, where it's either like, and it also is used a lot in this like binary form of like, you're either vegan or you're not, you're cruel, you're compassionate, you know, without giving much room for understanding like people's background, whether, you know, folks are in like food apartheid zones, whether they're navigating, you know, multiple identities of, you know, immigrants, you know, navigating multiple identities and socioeconomic status and so many other things, as well as communities healing from different trauma. I think for me as a Latina, it definitely clashed a lot with my identity. You know, meat was always like such a central part of like our diet growing up. So it was always like, oh, you know, it really clashed a lot with my identity. And then I, you know, as I did more research, I started to like learn more and really like get educated on many things that I didn't know about because of also systemic reasons, right? You know, I really was able to learn and understand that so many of our traditional foods were inherently plant-based, and kind of feeling a lot of grief and like how these like traditions were erased and replaced with these like Eurocentric ways of being in terms of food and in terms of like definitions themselves. I think the term also brings up a lot of feelings of like, at least when I was first starting to like, it was hard for me to really step into this term because it brought up a lot of feelings of like hypocrisy towards like, you know, white veganism. I saw how much like there was erasure and folks choosing to ignore, you know, land worker rights, like the exploitation of land workers, you know, like it's, you know, it was so interesting for me to see people being like, oh, cruelty free, but without really looking at like how much cruelty is actually rooted in like the labor system and the exploitation of like farm workers. And also, you know, it ignores a lot of like marginalized communities, you know, disabled folks, working class people, communities that live in apartheid zones, as well as, you know, now, like, I think it brings up even more feelings of seeing how like mainstream vegan white spaces have been silent about genocide and have been, you know, there's been so much like, oh, you know, calling themselves compassionate and calling themselves, you know, like, promoting, you know, compassion for all, but they're, you know, some of the folks are like the main ones to stay quiet about genocide and, you know, different ways that like different communities racially, politically, colonially are impacted by these terms. So it definitely, you know, the word veganism brings up a lot of mixed feelings for me because for a long time, and I think even till today, I still see it as a very like elitist Western way of being. So I do think that it's definitely necessary to maybe not so much, as we said earlier, like create a new term, but definitely like work towards decolonizing this current term that we have right now. Because I think at the moment, it doesn't seem so much as about like total liberation and justice, but like more of a sense of control, and that's something that doesn't sit well with me.
Thank you. Yes, I agree, and I think you all actually touched on it. How I feel it has been co-opted actually by capitalism, and capitalism is part of colonialism. And I used actually to love the word veganism. There is this quote by Philip Wallen where he talks about the word vegan being so beautiful, and I always said, "Wow, I completely agreed with him." But over the last 3 years, first because of my own personal experiences of abuse and bullying, within the vegan community, and later because of the silence of the mainstream vegan movement, I can't find it beautiful anymore. And like most of you, and I read some of the comments in the chat, I have mixed feelings now. I don't even know how I feel about the word vegan anymore. I know that I actually have a bodily reaction to it now when I hear it. And I still use it, by the way. I still use it myself. But something has changed. And obviously, the last 18 months, that has also played a huge role. And with that, I'm going to actually move the discussion to the genocide. Waseem, you are the only vegan Palestinian on the panel. So let's talk about the silence of mainstream veganism. How has that silence affected your relationship with the vegan movement?
Yes, thank you. That's a very excellent question, because I remember in the first week or two, I was feeling very frustrated since October 7th happened, of course, of all the destruction, but then also seeing the vegan community being so silent that I had to create a reel about, calling out, like, you call out for compassion, you call out for being empathetic, being, standing on the side of oppressed, but you're here and like you're silent, you're not doing anything about it. And one of the main things that affected how I viewed the relationship I had with those that I considered part of the community, again, I'm speaking more from the food space, because the account that I have, Plant-Based Startup, is actually a food blog space. I don't necessarily share food anymore, at least at this point, but a lot of those that were fellow vegan food bloggers, content creators, and so on, I had such a close relationship with them before that we would be in constant interactions, engagement, trying to like help each other out with the algorithm, with brand deals, with all that kind of stuff. And then as soon as that happened and I stopped doing that, and I started to raise awareness about the animal rights being co-opted by Israel to silence us, and then also how it's affecting Palestinians and the genocide and overall, that silence, even, with that. And it kind of shifted my mindset and kind of reinforced the idea that they were really there. I don't want to speak for everybody, but they were really there just for that, pushing for that capitalistic mindset, whether they realize it or not, because it just seemed all about diet and their own lifestyle and their own individual contribution to helping the animals, as opposed to viewing the entire interconnectedness of it all. So I kind of no longer interact with those people, and it just feels like a betrayal in a way, because I did feel before that I was not really fitting in that space in its own. Again, multiple other reasons of how the whole food space within veganism is also dominated by Western world, but it's a whole other topic. But then also when it comes to this, it's just a lot of betrayal, because, I know those people are viewing my stories are still there, but they're not doing anything about it. And it just goes to show that the whole word veganism is also bringing up that mixed emotion again, that to them it's the individual aspect of I'm doing good for the animals, and that's all that matters within my space. And when we talk about the actual genocide and how Israel is still touted and being promoted, I saw yesterday you posted something about somebody that is a BIPOC that was also giving props to the Israeli military for being so vegan. And it's like, again, like, this should not happen. It should just not happen. And the more it's happening, the more it's really concerning, because it's shifting more and more away from the values of anti-speciesism at the core of veganism. And so, yeah, that's, I'm shifting away from that whole idea of being in space within the vegan community. Again, one thing I want to touch on is that on the other side of that, and this goes back to the word vegan, is that like with Vegans for Palestine being created, you can see the word vegan in there, and that's mainly because it's a call out to the vegans that are actually standing with justice, that are actually feeling that, and that they feel the urge to do something about it. It's to unite us to create that different movement. And I know, and I recognize now that I'm seeing a lot of people that are within that space that are actually standing side by side with us, and even fighting the propaganda and the misconceptions about Israel's veganism. And I know it seems minor, very, very minor in the scale of things about genocide, but it's very important to recognize that this actually plays a big, big part. And not just because it's deterring vegans from speaking up about genocide and the oppression, but it's literally part of fueling the Israeli economy from the food tech and so on. So that's a whole other thing that I can go on for forever talking about, but we need to dismantle that as soon as possible, or else there's no vegan movement that can be truly for justice. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Waseem. I know that many of us, like I would call ourselves everyday grassroots vegans. We are not influencers. We are not part of big vegan organizations. For us, the silence has been incredibly painful and disappointing, and a real betrayal. I agree. And it's interesting because I find a lot of people, including non-vegans, they have pointed out the hypocrisy. I mean, something that I recently heard from a non-vegan lawyer is vegans, they fight for the lives of animals, but then they stay silent when it comes to human life. So it doesn't make sense to anybody. And I think that is one of the reasons that we feel the word vegan has changed. It has lost the meaning it used to have. Now, Estefania, I want to address you. You work with within the Latino communities. So from your experience, using the term veganism, does it create a barrier when you are working within your community? And if so, how do you work around that?
Thank you, Leila. Yes, absolutely. I do think that it definitely creates a barrier. We work with a lot of BIPOC communities, not necessarily only Latin American folks, but the origins of Veggie has that Latin American root to it as well. I definitely think that it often, especially with folks that we work with and have shared the experiences and their stories, it definitely often feels very foreign, very elitist, and very disconnected from our communities. It carries a lot of, implications on class and wealth and whiteness. I think that when you hear vegan, you always, at least for me in my experience as well too, always very much like pictured like, meat and dairy substitutes and things that are, often not as accessible or in terms of location, right? Being able to access it physically at a supermarket or in terms of being able to access it, financially and being able to afford certain things. So that's definitely one thing that has like really come up a lot. It doesn't always leave room for folks that are already deeply, rooted in their ancestral practices, but maybe necessarily don't call themselves vegan because they don't see themselves reflected in the movement. There's many folks that, when you have these conversations with them, you realize like, oh, okay, like you are living a primarily plant-based lifestyle, but you don't really connect to the word again because it has this history of this white man coining a term and being very Eurocentric and being kind of really forgetting about the indigenous and BIPOC roots that that plant-based living itself might have. I think it also kind of creates a sense of like shame or guilt or pressure at times for folks that might be navigating food insecurity or just different like cultural oppression or systemic oppression as well. So definitely I think with our work at Veggie Has, we really try to focus on the language that we use and accessibility. We prefer to use words like plant-based or decolonial eating or connecting to ancestral foodways instead of vegan, although we still do kind of, as you mentioned, Leila, like we still use it, right? But it still doesn't sit too well with us all the time. And I think that what we really are trying to focus on in our work is framing our work around like reclaiming and relearning those ancestral practices and highlighting specific cultural dishes and being able to maybe switching those into like more of a plant-based way of being, trying to center our cultural memories, through sharing recipes, through storytelling, through building community in ways that honor, the planet and the animals as well as our communities itself. I think, focusing on that community care and community building and never shaming anyone for the journey that they're on. I think we all have different maybe challenges, different obstacles that might always prevent us from being like fully vegan right away, but being able to equip folks with resources. So, we try to focus a lot on community resources, community events in terms of like cooking demos, whether we do virtual or in person. I think that's one way that we've been able to really connect with our communities, holding potlucks, holding specific like BIPOC only workshops and educational conversations where, we can have these kind of more vulnerable moments of being like, hey, let's share our stories, let's share our experiences and why we might not be able to, or why it might be challenging at times to really get to this point that, we might want to get to. And yeah, making it really about like reconnecting and not like restricting or judging folks, doing it in a way that feels joyful and not judgmental. I think another way too is we recently launched a digital cookbook, and so that was one way, titled Manteniendo Nuestra Cultura, preserving our culture. And so that was a way to really remind folks that like, we can connect to our cultural dishes. We can still, eat a lot of the foods that we grew up eating, but just in a way that is, more ethical, more aligned to our values, respecting the animals, respecting the planet, respecting our bodies and respecting our communities as well. And just honoring, like our ancestors in that way. So yeah, really just being able to highlight, plant-based eating as a tool for like survival, as well as resisting these oppressive systems, while we, navigate these like, these systems that really oppress us in a way that, we can leave behind like displacement and loss and just really reclaim those ways of being for ourselves.
Thank you. That's really interesting because, the word vegan, as you said, we all are kind of using it, but it's also very convenient. It's such a short word, you just say it and everybody knows exactly, what you are talking about. But, I'm an Iranian, and what I found is that there's actually no translation for the word vegan. In many countries around the world, people just say vegan, versions of vegan. Like, I don't think it matters that Germans say vegan, but in Iran, people say vegan. And I think, just using that foreign word, it has consequences. I used to work with a group of vegans in Iran, and they translated mainstream vegan materials into Farsi, and then they would, send it to me for proofreading. And it was so interesting because, they had translated like the standard American diet, or how many people in the UK suffer from diabetes. Why would anyone in Iran care about UK statistics? And I just think only vegans in Iran, those who were already vegans, they knew what vegan means. For most people, it is a foreign word. And when you are introducing a new way of life, a new way of eating, using a term that already feels disconnected or alien, it's going to make it more difficult for people actually to change their diets or their lifestyle, or even to understand it or to engage with it, because it's so foreign. And especially, again, I'm talking as an Iranian. In Iran, there is a big cultural gap. We have those people who want to be like modern and they want to copy the West, but then we also have those people who reject anything which is foreign. So when we are just translating the English materials, we miss what, as you were saying, what Iranians, the everyday Iranians, are struggling with. You miss that. So you're not really helping them to actually make that transition, to understand it. So I really believe, although, again, when we are speaking English, it's fine. We can say vegan. I don't mind, as long as we, change the context and the meaning behind the word. But I really believe that in the countries of the global South, we do need a new word, because if we just say, we use the term vegan, I think we can actually do more harm than good, to be honest. And we don't reach the people that we want to reach. And, that brings me to you, Yvette. Your Instagram handle, I like it because it has the word collective in it. And I think collective is the opposite of individualism, which we see, in colonial systems. So collective abolition. And I think that name, that handle actually already challenges the limits of the word veganism. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about it? Where are you? Yes, I can see you.
Thanks, Leila. I wouldn't mind at all. I'm over here taking notes. Like, this is not being recorded. I'm just so inspired. I'm like, wait. Dropping gems over here, everybody. So yeah, this answer is pretty straightforward for me. Including vegan anywhere in my handle, in my Instagram handle, was not attracting my tribe. Basically, I tried it for a long time. I tried variations and it was not working. Oh, by the way, Serenity, I think you're unmuted and we might be hearing your background a little bit, if just FYI. So collective abolition, as you said, it embodies a vision of working together to dismantle systems, practices, and institutions that perpetuate harm. The collective part speaks to the power of the people acting as a group. And then the abolition calls for the complete eradication of oppressive structures. And this not only attracts my tribe, as in people who think just like me, but I mean people who are genuinely interested in liberation. And vegans as a whole, I don't find are very serious about that, to be honest. But anyway, for me, veganism is inseparable from the collective abolition. The veganism piece is inseparable because the animal industrial complex is something that inflicts harm across species lines. It's just as harmful as anything else. And not just inside of our industrialized agriculture, but across fashion and entertainment and the industrial pet complex as well. So, and it's also said, I will remind that societies can be judged by how they treat their most vulnerable. So if we treat animals with respect, avoiding harm wherever possible, I think that can reflect a society capable of greater compassion and justice for all beings. So veganism, the philosophy is at my center. And, I don't want to go on too long, but I also will address, because we're willing to be here, but we all know that outside of this space, these kinds of critiques or renaming or suggesting things like collective abolition is going to get a lot of pushback from mainstream or institutionalized spaces. We know an alarming number of animal rights advocates who act like any critique is basically setting the movement on fire with alternative motives. And they're like, here we go again, another undercover attempt to make this a human-centered movement. And they hear a critique and immediately clutch their sanctimony. But aside from lacking an understanding that critique isn't a threat to the movement, to any movement work, and that it's really a fuel for growth, I think their pushback is so ironic, because the human-centered argument, there's nothing more human-centered than ego, and particularly that of white saviorism, insisting that we can isolate animal issues in a vacuum and then swoop in as heroes and ignore the human exploitation that they're intimately tied to and that disproportionately harm marginalized communities, and that these systems exploit people, animals, and ecosystems all at the same time. So pretending that we can liberate animals without dismantling colonialism, capitalism, and systemic racism is naive at best, but I think it's very harmful. And it's like, if you weren't listening to me just now, the folks that have the audacity to show up to the potluck with raisins and the potato salad are then going to get upset that I'm calling it what it is, which is bland. And then I'm like, it's not about decentering animals. It's just about how systems of oppression don't operate in little neat silos, and you can't cherry pick liberation. And that's why I put myself in Apex. We put our energy into creating spaces where decolonial lenses are not just tolerated, but it's foundational to the work we do. We center marginalized voices and build connections with other social justice movements, because we want people to see that animal liberation is inseparable from other struggles. And my hope is that one day folks will see the fight for animals as just as urgent and undeniable as the fight for climate justice, racial justice, indigenous sovereignty, and the rest. And if in institutionalized or quote unquote mainstream vegan spaces aren't ready for that conversation, you won't catch me losing any sleep, because I am too busy building something much better with flavor this time. That's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. We need to build our own tables. And I think part of these discussions that we are having, these, different panel discussions, is because we are creating our own tables. We are done asking for a seat at their table. And I find it really interesting because when we talk about the mainstream vegan spaces, most of us, we have been actually in those spaces. We have been volunteers or working, and they always really cherry pick, if talking about climate change brings them followers, yes, of course they are, all for it. But human, kind of justice, nah, not so much. And I'm a nutritionist, and what I really find interesting is that a lot of, those whole food plant-based, spaces, they don't realize how much they are promoting colonial values. It is just like kind of, when they talk about food and health, it is actually what they are talking about is colonial and Western values. They promote a very specific body kind of ideal, and maybe they don't even notice that because, a lot of plant-based professionals and health influencers, those vegan influencers, they keep saying like, how a vegan diet helps you lose weight. But then what they are not understanding is that when you are talking like that, and some vegans are not really kind of skinny, a lot of vegans are not, but then they make you actually feel like you have failed at veganism. You're not doing everything right. And so they're actually reinforcing, body shaming. And they don't realize that that is a Western value. Like kind of, there is a special, ideal way of looking. I don't know how to call it. And also, I remember, like, myself, I follow a whole food plant-based diet as much as I can. And once I posted a picture of a meal, which was bought from a fast food brand, for those who are in the UK, they know Leon, and then I got all the comments. This is not whole foods. Why are you eating that? And it was actually after I had taken part in a panel discussion against the non-vegan. And so I was feeling proud of myself for daring to actually take part in that panel discussion. And I was tired and I was just wanted something to eat. And then all those vegans made me feel bad. Instead of actually kind of maybe saying something nice about what I had achieved, they were just criticizing my food, which was not whole foods. And also, I think, this constant messaging that a whole food plant-based diet can heal everything. I mean, they keep saying, it's not a all cured diet or whatever, but at the same time, they say, oh yes, it does heal this and that, and then they ignore the health impacts of stress, racism, systemic injustice, and discrimination. It's just interesting because BIPOC healthcare professionals, I have noticed that they like actually to call themselves plant-based, whereas a lot of kind of, white healthcare professionals who come into veganism through the plant-based, like kind of health lens, they keep talking about, being vegan. And there are so many of them. Some of you know Dr. Garth Davis, who actually is a Zionist, and he calls himself a vegan, although he changed his diet for health reasons. And so I think there is a lot of like kind of, mixing and not really knowing what they are doing. And it's just because they really don't understand, discrimination, injustice. They have no sense of what liberation or justice looks like or should be. And I think what happens is that a lot of these vegan messages, whether it is about health or animal rights, it actually sounds like it's more for the privileged. They really dismiss all the other people. And then they get annoyed that the non-vegans say that veganism is like just, for the wealthy, and, only the wealthy, privileged people can afford it. But then, they actually, the way they are promoting the ideas that they are promoting actually, supports that hypothesis. I feel sometimes that, as I said, it has been co-opted by capitalism, and it's just more about profit now. It has nothing to do with animals, even those who, even outside of plant-based communities, where, the focus is obviously on nutrition. I think even animal rights activists, it's not really, the focus is not on animals anymore. It's more on their own egos and what they want to achieve, or, just having this influencer culture. That is such a colonial tool, and we see that a lot in the vegan spaces. Now, I had a quick look at the chat. I don't see any questions. So I have, again, one final question for everyone. Obviously, the panelists will answer it now, but you can write it in the chat. And as I said, I will go through all of that and share some of them, maybe even all of them, on social media. So my last question is, if we wanted to create a new word or movement, not like a word or to replace veganism, but to build something in its place, again, not as a label, but as a practice or ethic, what would it look like? What would it be for you? Estefania, do you want to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that for this question, definitely, I've been given it a lot of thought, and I'm like, I don't know that there is like a specific word for sure that comes to mind, or that even fully, kind of encompasses everything that we've talked about. But I definitely think that if we were to build something in place of veganism, I want it to be centered around, similar to what Yvette was mentioning, just like this collective abolitionist perspective. I think that it needs to be more of not necessarily a word or a label, but more of a framework, asking ourselves like how we can nourish each other, take care of the animals, honor the land, honor the earth, without this like mentality of like extraction, but more so just being able to give back and like reciprocity towards the land. I think that it would need to be something, rooted in the return to our lands, to the seed saving, to the teaching of our elders, more grounded in collective care and interdependence, and working together, where food, where all of it really focuses on like food justice, labor justice, climate justice, animal justice, cultural survival, things like that. I think that wanting it to be more of like a decolonial term, it needs to be rooted in, being able to have control of the things that we grow and like the foods that we share. So a lot of food sovereignty, land-based knowledge, obviously anti-capitalist views and perspectives, cultural memories as well, being able to, share what has already been practiced for, so many years before colonization, took over and decided to make it seem like, this way of being and this way of, animal agriculture and things like that were, the right way of doing things. So I think more so like things that come to mind for me are more like questions, it's like, do these, if this new framework, right, that we're envisioning, like, do the people feel included and invited rather than being like judged? And does it allow room for, cultural survival and community care over judgment? Is it something that, my abuelita and like my ancestors, and like, my elders can say, right, and feel connected to, and feel like, they actually have ties to that, and rather it being something that's very white and elitist? And does it honor their land, the memory and the resistance that we are all, on this journey together? So definitely something, that just decenters individualism, something that decenters this Eurocentric perspective, that decenters, capitalist consumption, and more really focused on like resistance and care for all beings.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Waseem, I can't see you on my screen. Can you go next?
Yes, thank you. I love what Estefania just said, with decentering specifically, because one thing I realize is when I'm back home, well, where I grew up in Jordan, I would speak about these things. I would always mention that like it's not a new thing. Veganism itself is not a new thing. And the term is used more often now and it's more trendy and so on, but just understanding that when you want to approach people who are outside of the movement, for example, and you want to invite them in and teach them about this philosophy that you believe in, try to make connections with your own culture as opposed to looking at what the world overall tells you what this is. So whether it's from the food or from the practices that you have, like, I don't know who it was from the panel that mentioned, I think it was Yvette that mentioned about, the way you treat the most marginalized says a lot about what you do as a person, how your morals are. And I believe in Turkey, how there's you walk in the streets and you see a lot of cats being taken care of. There's always like food on the ground and all that. So like just caring and having that compassion for the animals on its own is something that part of the culture that you can always refer to, even though maybe Turkey might not be the most vegan country in the world, which is not the point. I think the point is connecting with that cultural ties. And then you talk about food and realizing that you don't have to, be an elitist or wealthy to be on a vegan diet and so on. Because like you look back at your traditional dishes and you look back at the way we used to eat long time ago before colonization. I know, Leila, you mentioned, when we first started that, decolonization doesn't necessarily mean that we go back to the original roots of how our ancestors used to be, but also taking parts of that is important to realize that like they also lived by that philosophy to whatever extent you want to say. Maybe there was no word for it, there was no label for it, they weren't 100% vegan, but they had that impact, that compassion and that passion also for not doing harm to others or that helping others. Again, you can look at, like, for example, in Syria over 1,000 years ago, there's this poet that his name is Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, and he was vegan, and he wrote a poem about like not wanting to hurt animals and not wanting to consume anything of their of them, whether it's for food or for clothes, and that and he emphasized that that was more of a selfish thing if you're doing so. And he was a controversial figure, sure, but there's a lot about like connecting that with, like, again, our traditions that we live by, which is just not causing harm in general, whether it's for the humans or for the animals. So I think that when you want to work around veganism, whether you choose the word veganism or another word that maybe fits best in your own language, because it doesn't really translate well in a lot of languages, like you said, but just describe the philosophy before you try to put a label on it. I think that's most important, which I think nobody can disagree with, not wanting to cause harm. Why would you want to cause harm if that's what is being done? But again, not everybody's going to make the switch overnight. Not everybody's going to make the connection the same way. Not everybody is privileged in the same way that can completely shift, for example. But I don't think that that's the point. The point is just being in a collective that cares about being anti-oppression. And for as long as we're working towards that within our own group, within our own tribes, our own communities, then I think that's what can help bring us closer to veganism.
Thank you. Very interesting. By the way, when I said we shouldn't go back to just doing what our ancestors were doing, I wanted to preempt when people say, oh, we have to, so do you mean like we should go back to living in caves? That's what I meant. I didn't mean
yes.
ancestral kind of knowledge and wisdom. That's not what I meant. Anyway, thank you for highlighting that. So Yvette.
Hi. I'm over here still taking notes. I'm so inspired by what you're saying. I'm really glad that a few of you chose to interrogate the word decoloniality, even because, we can't actually go backwards. We're in we can build a post-colonial world. And, some of those traditions, they no longer serve us or the earth. And it really speaks to me as someone claiming my indigenous identity, because it's often judged when I do that in a way that makes me feel like I have no right to evolve and everything has to be traditional, and that I don't get to be post-colonial, and I don't get to interrogate societies that, frankly, were not perfect, as if there were such a thing. But if I were to imagine a practice or an ethic to build in place of what we have going on right now, I think I would I would draw from all my relations, which is a Native American, excuse me for using that term, but philosophy, but we all know what I mean. And Ubuntu from South Africa. So all my relations reminds us that every being is part of an interconnected web of life, and we exist in relation and not in isolation, which not only benefits vegan principles, but I think to Palestine and Israel and their children versus our children paradigms that will ultimately destroy all of us. And Ubuntu teaches that our humanity is bound together. It translates to something like "I am because we are," which is so beautiful. And both of these sort of philosophies see animals as kin and not as separable and separate and not as subservient. So treating them with the respect afforded to family, essentially, and the earth as well. So this kind of framework doesn't just transform how we think about animals. I think it heals the way that we treat one another, which is what's missing from veganism, the label currently. And because when we can't recognize non-human suffering, I think it erodes our compassion towards humans too. So it goes both ways. But of course, the challenge for institutionalized vegans or the movement to join us in building this kind of ethic and any of these ethics, it also has to abandon the individualism model that's driven its strategy for decades. Which we can also see is not working. We stay at that 1% or less than 1%. So for anyone to still be hung up on the go vegan and the birthing of the terms like cruelty free that completely ignore the corporate systems and structures perpetuating harm is beyond me. I don't get it. But if we're to move towards a future rooted in interconnection and care, we need to build an ethic grounded in a shared responsibility for liberation, not isolated acts of consumption. That's the path I ultimately feel like we need to walk together. I don't want to sound ableist, but that we need to join together, essentially.
Thank you. That was all very interesting. And I took a few notes because there were a few words that stood out, and I feel like, it was the essence of what was being said. Sorry for summarizing it in a few simple words. What I heard a lot was like kind of, care, community care, connection, decentering, and again, interconnection, relations and relationships, and being responsible for each other. And, that is what the mainstream vegan kind of community criticizes us, isn't it? Like we talk about interconnection, and that is exactly what they don't want to have. So, but yes, at the root of it, that is what we need to have, isn't it? Just to recognize that we are all interconnected. And if we want to survive, we need to take care of all of us, each other and everybody. I just saw one question, so I'm going to read that out. And Olivia, if you want to say who you want to answer that. How do you navigate conversations with non-vegan leftist people who claim they are anti-oppression, anti-capitalist, who seem to fully reject the idea of speciesism? I feel like finding a decolonized term for veganism might aid these incredibly frustrating conversations. Who wants to take that one? Go on, Yvette. Is that okay?
I'm over here scrolling, looking for the question. I found it. Olivia
G.
It
keeps moving.
I'm visual, not audio. So
Me
I'm like,
too.
I read the question. How do I navigate conversations with non-vegan leftist people who claim they are anti-oppression, anti-capitalist, who seem to fully reject the idea of speciesism? Can't do anything about that. I feel like finding a decolonial term for veganism might aid. Yes. So yeah, you answered your own question partly. That's why we're here. I think a lot of us align with these leftist spaces. I can speak for myself. It's not always going to happen, but I think that we can understand. Just breathe. It's frustrating, I know, but breathe and then think about it, or think about ourselves pre-vegan. It is actually completely understandable that they quote unquote don't get it. It really is. You think about what is out there to the point where we're saying quote unquote mainstream, and we know veganism isn't mainstream, but it's a very institutionalized, white leaning kind of system. So that's what they're being fed. I see it being done. People tag me all the time saying, hey, I know this is what you think of veganism, but check out this person's work or check out that person's work. And so that they can kind of see that things are interconnected. One of the ways that I suggest doing this also is just, building the alliances and trying to find out ways that other communities like BIPOC communities, or just like specifically like indigenous communities who are trying to push towards plant-based food systems, find out ways they're thinking. What terminologies are they using? What ways could we make this more accessible? We don't necessarily even have to have all the answers and the tools, because sometimes we don't even realize how limited our own language is already, just because we've been presented with this white canon of work. When we were learning about veganism or decided to become veganism ourselves, we were all reading Eating Animals. We were all watching the same documentaries. We were all doing the things. And that didn't equip us with being the best strategists, I think, for making this a global urgent issue. It made it an issue from a Western lens, and at best. So I think have some grace, and also interrogate, re-strategize your own advocacy language, because I think that I see some leftists, vegan leftists, using the individual purity language when we don't even mean to, treating veganism like a personal virtue test when we don't mean to do that. And I also think that we could really benefit from language rooted in abundance and not abstinence. And I also catch us doing that, like, oh, we don't eat meat and we don't use we don't do this, when I feel like decolonial frameworks really emphasize abundance rather than lack across the board, as sort of a rule of thumb. And a newly envisioned ethic could focus on what is gained. And I think that resonates a lot, a shared sense of what is gained. So nurturing justice for all beings, for example, or restoring interspecies community, for example, and things like that, instead of go vegan and, etc., cruelty-free, this and that. I don't want this to be a TED Talk, but that's my general answer, unless anyone else wants to chime in.
Thank you. That was a great answer. We have actually one more question, so I'm going to go ahead and read that if it doesn't move. Decolonization is also recognizing the autonomy of indigenous people. What is your position if these practices are harmful and harm animals? There are a lot of indigenous people who practice animalistic rituals where it involves killing an animal. How do we navigate these nuances? Estefania, Waseem, which one of you would like to take that one?
I can very briefly touch on that. I think as being non-indigenous, person, I think it's just important to have respect for people's history and for people's, way of being. I know that sometimes it's definitely and sorry, I'm also looking at the question again too, because I also am more of a visual, trying to find where it went. Sorry, where did the question go? Yeah, I think, in this case, it's like, when we're having these conversations, it's definitely meeting people where they are and not being judgmental of many, practices. I think that there are many indigenous communities, obviously, that still use animal products, that still use, animals in different ways, whether it's for fur, whether it's for different things. And I think it's always just remembering that colonization itself just kind of violently disrupted many indigenous practices and many indigenous ways of being, either through stealing land, through destroying local ecosystems, through imposing their own beliefs and diets. And so I think that this forced introduction of animal agriculture and ways of being into indigenous communities kind of really shifted the beliefs and the ways that other communities still had. So I think, when maybe we're having these conversations with indigenous communities, I think it's really about having respect and trying to just have conversations and, meet them where they are. I think that it's important to not impose, these beliefs that now we might have as vegans or, as folks that are trying to practice collective liberation. And I think that, just not imposing these beliefs on folks and just necessarily being respectful and having conversations with them about maybe why, certain practices are still being used and trying to maybe have a better understanding of that rather than, having this colonial mindset as well, being we, veganism is this maybe civilized or, or right way of being without understanding truly what the practices embody and why they might still be doing them. But again, as someone that doesn't identify as indigenous myself, think sometimes that's a little hard conversation for me to have or for me to answer. So yeah, Yvette, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Estefania. Before Yvette, you go ahead. Firstly, we need to be conscious of the time. And maybe Waseem wants to also say something because, we as Muslims, we have, the festival of sacrifice where we kill animals. Oh, they used to kill animals, Yvette, do you want to go? But just be conscious of the time. Go on.
No, I'll keep it short and cute because Estefania, you did a great job. The first thing I would say is there are indigenous vegans out there and speak to them, align with them, do your research, because this is a kind of a question you should directly ask. And I don't want to be dismissive of this question here, but I would also remind us, because it's a little bit alarming to me how much this question comes up. And that only leads me to believe that we are not then focusing on the trillions of beings that we bring into existence just to slaughter them for our consumption. And so what we ask here is we're honing in on a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. I don't even know how small you can get into comparison. So focus on those animals is I don't have the word for it, but it is interesting. It is interesting. So not that it's not a valid question, but please align yourself with indigenous folks who are doing the work towards plant-based food systems and who recognize, like myself, that these rituals no longer serve us necessarily. So it's not that being in solidarity with indigenous communities means you have to recognize or you have to co-sign every single thing that they do. There's many ways to be in solidarity, and many ways veganism is beneficial to indigenous communities by and large. And you can focus there without worrying our pretty little heads about the 3 animals that got sacrificed over the year. We can maybe focus on the trillions that we that are killing us and the planet.
Thank you. Waseem, do you want to talk about the festival?
Yeah, I can just briefly touch on that. So I really appreciate what Yvette and Estefania said, and because and again, not to be dismissive of the question because it is important, but it is kind of shifting the blame in a way where it's kind of putting it on the indigenous people for practicing something that the West perceives uncivilized. And that's in itself is the problem. Not the colonization, not the whole destroying the rainforests to build these massive factories of animal agriculture to have these trillions of animals to be killed just for food and clothes and stuff that does not really is needed. But when it comes to Islam, for example, I am a vegan Muslim, so I do understand the ritual of sacrifice when it comes to Eid. But again, I don't want to say something out of context here, and I can't remember exactly if people want to say that it's like in Islam, it's like you must do it, or it's do it if you're able to, in the sense that it happens on a holiday, and understanding the context of that. But I'm not saying that it's like how I would want to say is if you want to follow, like I get that question a lot, and there are vegan imams even in Islam. The imam is the one that leads the prayer and holy person. So like there are vegan imams that I know that could probably answer this question better. But how I would frame it is, if you want to tackle the question as a Muslim, when I get it, why are there vegan Muslims that do that? I would say that if you want to go to Islam itself, it's actually in a way anti-oppression and anti-not wanting to do harm to animals itself. So understanding the relationship you have with that. And again, not putting it, not saying that it's okay, but hear me out on this. When it comes to the halal killings, for example, it's also taken out of context because right now in these days, it's also being done in a very commercialized way where it's also to serve the needs of the consumption as opposed to the way that people lived back then in terms of one sheep or so to serve the community back then that was at the time much less than we are right now. But then there's also that element of, again, every sentient being feels and understands. But what I'm saying is that right now the halal is taken in a way that like, as long as you're saying Bismillah on it, then it's fine, go ahead and do it. But reality, it's much more than that. For example, not having the animal near other animals when that's being done. And there's a lot of context to be put into that to understand that Islam itself doesn't want you to be harming animals. There are necessities at the time when it was being done for communities to survive and so on. But how I would say is, at the end of the day, don't focus on, or not don't focus, but let's focus on the bigger commercialized capitalistic structure that makes that affecting more and more of the animals overall, as opposed to the one holiday that happens that this is must happening on. So I hope that answers your question, and maybe it's, I'm happy to elaborate more on that, but there are better people that can explain this than me. Like I said, a vegan imam that I know that. And there's also an episode I want to say of our friend Dalal from Vegans for Palestine, who has a podcast in Arabic. She's a vegan Palestinian, vegan Muslim also, that interviewed another vegan Muslim, Lebanese woman, that they cover this topic as well. So in that podcast, it's called What the Batikh. You guys can find it if you need to, and there's more to learn about that, veganism and Islam and how that better fits the topic. And I'm more qualified than I am to discuss it.
Thank you. When I said we shouldn't go back to doing whatever our ancestors used to do, that is exactly what I meant. Just because, our ancestors used to do certain things doesn't mean that we should be doing it, because the context has changed. And again, I'm a vegan Muslim myself. And when we talk about Islam, a lot of the teachings that we have in Islam, they have to be interpreted in the context of today's world. So even the sacrifice, it's not must kill an animal, you must sacrifice something. It doesn't have to be an animal. And also going back to that question, I can't remember who asked that question, but I think only indigenous people should discuss what they are gonna do with those rituals. Anybody, most people who actually ask those questions, I'm not saying you are, because I don't even remember who asked that question, but it's mainly, as Waseem actually pointed out, it's usually some kind of, a white person or somebody who is racist and who wants just to say like, these uncivilized people. So that's why they are asking that question. It has nothing to do with trying really to reduce harm to animals. And I really think it is up to those communities to have those discussions. It's the same with Islam. I think only vegan Muslims or Muslims should be having these discussions about, Eid, and we cannot and should not have somebody from outside coming and telling us. That is again part of decolonization. We have our own voices, our own agency. So thank you very much. I'm going to actually wrap it up. Before we do, I want to hear from our panelists, and hopefully it's going to be again one sentence. Just if you could share one practical action that people who are listening to this discussion can take to move veganism closer to collective liberation. Estefania, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what a lot of us said, and like my answer earlier, is definitely like decentering a lot of these like systems that are currently in place, decentering this consumption, and really centering the voices and leadership of BIPOC folks in all of these spaces that, this is all very intersectional, right? We've talked about, animal rights, social justice rights, the environment, land workers, so many other intersection groups. So I think it's really important to just center the voices of BIPOC individuals that are already doing a lot of this work, especially as land workers, as healers, or stewards of traditional knowledge, and really being able to kind of put those at the forefront and listening to BIPOC individuals, learning from the work that so many are already doing, and also focusing on mutual aid, on land, respecting the land, rematriation, returning to the land, focusing on food sovereignty as essential parts of this like plant-based, like ethical way of being that we want to focus on. So I think really just centering voices of folks that are really doing this work and have been making so much progress in this work already.
Thank you. Waseem?
Yeah, so I want to emphasize what Estefania just said, which is decentering the mainstream vegan movement, especially those that have been silent on other issues, whether it's the genocides, the multiple genocides that are happening or else. But aside from also listening to BIPOC people, vegans that do exist all over the world, I would also say that if you are a Westerner or live in Western society, also try to challenge the systems that you're living under that forces veganism to be perceived as an elitist thing. So like question, why is it that fast food is $5 to get a meal that you're full, but to get beans, to get all the foods that you need to live is also priced at a much higher price. So start questioning these. And if you do live in that Western world, then try to challenge the systems that are there, your politicians and else, to work on making food sovereignty an actual thing for all people, not just your own, where you live in. So I don't want to add too much on that because I think Estefania covered it pretty well on that as well.
Thank you. Yvette?
One practical action, moving veganism closer to collective liberation, widen the scope. We don't have to move the center away from animals, but widen the scope. If more of us tied, for example, divesting from animal exploitation to supporting food workers and advocating for fair treatment and unionization efforts in plant-based industries and food production spaces to ensure veganism supports all beings, then this kind of message and effort, I believe, would move us a lot closer to collective liberation. Think living wages for food workers, plant-based initiatives that actually reach underserved areas, and collaborating with indigenous communities to honor sustainable practice, not just vegan practices or vegan certified ones. So it starts with reframing, and because veganism isn't about being perfect, it should be about being part of a systemic change. So just widen that scope.
Thank you. All very good, useful, practical actions that we can take. And if I may add, one more is, especially, the more privileged you have, whether it is you being, white or any other privilege you have, speak up. Because whenever you see an injustice and, discrimination, bullying, anything, any sort of, kind of injustice, by you, using your privilege to speak up about it, you make the space safer for other people. You bring us closer to justice, to collective liberation. Thank you, everybody. So I think, yes, gosh, it was long, but I really enjoyed it. It went so fast. I could have spoken longer, but I think, considering that some people are going to listen to it, watch it later, if it is long, they may actually not get bored. I don't think anybody's going to get bored, by what we discussed here, but I still think, 1.5 hours is good. We shouldn't really go over that. Thank you so much to my panelists. It was really amazing having you here. I'm going to go through all the chat and the comments. If any, I'm going to actually share them anonymously, so this way you're safe. Nobody's going to be exposed. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Leila. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, everybody, for putting up with all the things. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone.